We had a lot of discussions as the conference planning committee about what this panel session would be aimed at and what we were hoping to achieve, or for you in particular, what you might be able to take away from this session. Then Rosie Heineke and I had some really fabulous conversations with our panel members, and they were amazing, Rosie. I think you'll admit each time we caught up afterwards and thought, oh my God, this is going to be incredible. But how do we draw these threads together? So we've had some great conversations, and what I'm really confident of is that you're going to have the chance to hear from our panel members some things that will probably challenge you in your thinking, things that you might have already been thinking about yourself, and you might go, yeah, I get that. But one of the things that we really wanted to achieve, particularly as the planning group for this conference, the first of the trilogy, was that we would be able to give you the opportunity to think about yourself as leaders in your schools, in your regions, but also as a member of our association, of a professional association of school leaders in public education in South Australia. This is a really important part of our conference, and to have it on day 2 at this time is something that we thought was very pertinent. You know, over, was it yesterday, the common thread around what we can do and how important it is for us to have our own story, for you to have your story as leaders, but also for us as an association to have our story. It's a really important moment in time. So we want to give you the chance to start thinking about that. We definitely want to give you the chance to start thinking about the power of the collective voice of SASPA as you listen to the perspectives of the members of our panel. We've tasked Danielle Elston, who is the CEO of the Good Government Advisory Organisation, to facilitate this discussion. Danielle is well placed to do this. She's been working with us for over 12 months now. Prior to that was working with the Department for Education, and now works with lots of associations in supporting them to work effectively, efficiently, get what they want from government organisations across Australia. So we've been doing some of that work with Danielle. She helped us to shape our strategy, which you'll see a copy of on your table, and we talked about it last year. But she's also been working with our strategic network groups and our board to really get clarity around the position of our association on a number of different really important issues for us. One of them, you're not going to be surprised to hear these, I hope not anyway, one of them is around ESP funding. We want to be clear about what the challenges are for you as leaders in schools around that process and what it is that we think might be helpful in moving forward, so that we can, when we're working with our colleagues in the department, be really clear about that. We don't want to just go with what the problems are. We're wanting to make sure that we're in a position that says, look, we want to work together on how we can improve this for the benefit of the young people in our schools. We're also working on a position paper around leader development, and that's around the kind of professional learning that you as leaders would value, given our current purpose of public education, the work that's happening in SACE, the work that's happening with the South Australian curriculum for public ed, etc., etc. What is it that's really going to help you, and what would constitute quality professional learning? And again, we've been working really quite closely with our colleagues in the department. Jackie Van Rieten is here with us today, and we've had conversations about that. But getting clear about what it is that we want, what we're looking for, is an important part of our association's voice. And then the other paper that we've made a lot of progress on, which is a board paper, is around the media and the impact that the media is having on you as leaders in your school and in your school communities. This is very complex. But we've been working with Amy McDonald, who joined us yesterday, the newly appointed communications officer from the department, really so that she can be clear about the fact we're not coming in here with complaints, we're coming in here with a very strong advocacy piece, but we're wanting to work with them around how they can better support you as leaders in your schools. So this is the work that Danielle's been doing with us, and it's been invaluable, Danielle. Can't thank you enough for that support that you've provided to us. But now you've got the task of coordinating this panel. I wish you all the best. And hang on, everyone. This is hopefully going to be very challenging and interesting for us all. Thanks, Danielle.
No pressure, Jane. Jeepers, no pressure there, Jane. It is an enormous pleasure to be here today. I have absolutely loved my last 12 months working with SASPA. You bring joy to everything that you do, and it is always an honour to continue to push your agenda forward as much as possible and as clearly as possible. I'm not an educator myself. Something I think my teenagers would say is very much for the best. But I have had that privilege of working on your policy agenda and with the department and seeing SASPA grow in its influence and being the first port of call for government when it is grappling with some really challenging economic and social conditions that are not limited to education, because your work intersects with the work of the NDIS, the work in corrections, the work of the police. It is not limited to one portfolio because you have all children in your care. So in preparing for today, I did a nerdy Sunday deep dive into the data and had this crazy idea that even though I am not the best place to do so, I would set the scene on inequality and inequity and the economic and social circumstances for South Australian children. But it's before lunch on the second day. I'm not the expert on that. You are the expert on that. And so I decided that perhaps before I pass over to our eminent panel, I'll just tell a story of how education transformed my life and my family's life. So my father was poor and working class. Two words we just don't use in Australia anymore. We use vulnerable, which is, I think, linguistically and technically accurate, but I think it also washes away the mess and the sharpness of poverty. I think it makes it sound like a social problem that an academic can fix, as opposed to something that is much messier and harder to tackle. My great-grandmother was a single mother of 13 who supported her children through sex work. My grandparents were transient publicans, so my father went to 13, we stopped counting primary schools at 11, and had whole patches of time where he wasn't in school at all. Moving in the 40s, 50s and 60s from Broken Hill to Dubbo to Darwin to Port Adelaide to Broome was not for the faint-hearted. It was a life of instability and poverty and violence. School was a place where he could have, and in fact probably statistically should have, not belonged, because he always had the wrong uniform, he'd never read the first half of the book, he was only there for 6 weeks, he was never properly prepared for what was required of him. All the markers were there for a predetermined outcome in life. But each of these schools, in the back of beyond, found a way to convince him that education transcended a single school and that he was entitled to and belonged to being educated, whether that was in one school or many schools. When they could have seen my father doing scams, they saw entrepreneurship and a mathematic ability. When they could have seen obstinance and defiance, they saw a sense of social justice and a capacity to deliver an articulate argument in any circumstance, particularly the front bar of a pub. These educators kept looking, and the more they looked, the more skills they found, and the more they told him that those skills were valuable. They encouraged him to stay at school, and somehow he finished Year 12, an incredible achievement and first in his family. He worked full-time hours in primary school and secondary school, and his teachers managed to work their way around that. His teachers then suggested that the only option that didn't require you to have capital wealth in the early 60s in order to go on after school was to go to Teachers College. This is where it takes a dark turn. This is not where I tell you where I come from a long line of educators. Dad's first practicum was at a private boys' school, and in his second week, he tossed a child over a fence onto Equitable Terrace. And his supervising teacher suggested that maybe he didn't have the temperament for it. As his daughter of 45 years when he passed away, I can assure you that practicum supervising teacher knew what he was talking about. So he kept what his teachers told him about his strengths and went for a much, much less honourable career path and became a lawyer. He went back to cleaning the Holden factory and saving his money and running side hustles, all the while hearing those teachers' voice telling him that he was worthy of this and he did have the potential. He started his first year without knowing how he would pay for his second year, and then Gough Whitlam was elected, and the rest, as they say, is history. But while my father's life was transformed by education, the rest of his extended family did not experience that. They faced the early death, the high rates of incarceration, and lived constantly on the brink of disaster that most people with that statistical makeup experience. That's the reality of poverty. Once it takes hold, it actually doesn't let go very easily, and the impacts can be felt over many generations. So you can take the boy out of Broken Hill, but you can't take the Broken Hill out of the boy. And his education did not entirely solve intergenerational impacts of poverty and inequality. But that sense that he was entitled to an education, that he belonged there, changed his life, and that changed my life, and that changed my children's lives. You have little Kim Elstons in all of your classrooms, and you are the experts in them. We have some of the best people in the field here today to dig into the realities of creating an equitable education system. And you'll take the insights from these panels, whether they be individually in your own school site, or your role in your profession, or the opportunity to activate collective action in the association to drive forward the change that you are the experts in and that no one else can be the experts in. So let's get into it, starting with the SASPA President and someone who inspires me every time I have the great privilege to talk and work with her. Eva Kannis-Torry has dedicated 38 years to education, working across urban and rural settings, including the Parks, Whyalla, Taparoo, and for the past 20 years, Thebarton Senior College. Throughout her career, Eva has held leadership positions in counselling, curriculum, timetabling and development, giving her a deep understanding of the complex and diverse needs of educational communities. Particularly committed to advocating for students from culturally and linguistically diverse and disadvantaged backgrounds, Eva has been a staunch advocate for equity and educational opportunity. As the President of SASPA for the past 3 years, she has also played a pivotal role in the strategic planning to address the challenges facing secondary leaders. Please welcome Eva Kannis-Torry.
You got that? All right. Okay, someone's going to have to show me how to drive this. Thank you, Danielle, for that beautiful introduction and also for sharing your story with us. It just reminds us how powerful narratives are. You see on the screen there a photo of some of our students that I'm going to refer to at the beginning and at the end of my presentation. And the young man with the white jumper on, that's Mohammed. He came from Syria some 3 years ago with zero English. He could read and write fairly fluently in Arabic. He was really very angry because the Syrians didn't get a lot of choice. They were happy to be safe, but not really happy to be out of their villages. And just, I think Christelle was sitting with her back to us. She came from the Congo. She was in New Arrivals program when we took that photo. The young woman with the long hair is Yasmin from Iran, and she's actually Afghani, but had lived in Iran for many years, and therefore was very skilled in textiles, which is code for carpet weaving, had worked as a child, and we can sit here from a Western perspective and go, ooh, child labour is terrible, but if it's keeping your family alive and it's providing you the opportunity to do some learning, it's not so terrible at all. We have to be careful of the lens within which we view, and by the way, that Save the Children's official view. As long as children are supported to go to education, they can and may have to work, not unlike your father. Devon came to us from another school, and I imagine she would have been a real handful in another school, but because of the type of timetabling, which I'll speak to later on, she really was able to just enjoy the flexibilities. And Darius, the young English-speaking background man in the photo there, came to us from Queensland and sadly couldn't get into his local school because of capacity management issues, so he ended up at Thebarton. So we're an unzoned senior secondary site, and I want you to imagine what that might look like. There are kids from across the 3 sectors, from all over Adelaide, from as far away as Gawler and from as far away as Nairn and Mount Barker. We have kids from all over the place. We're a Category 3 Index of Disadvantaged school. We also offer curriculum guarantee to young people from other sites, and that's from across the 3 schooling sectors. So on any given day, you could have students there from 60 different schools all participating together. We have a young parents program. Used to be called Young Mums, but we're not allowed to say that anymore. It's a Young Parents program that's run off-site and in partnership with Metropolitan Youth Health. We're a school-based RTO, and so as such, we've got about 200 students who sit in the school-based RTO from a range of other schools. Our new arrivals program has just over 400 students, and that grows weekly, and that has some challenges for us. And our SASE has approximately 600 students in it. So within our context, 58% of the students, that changes because we enrol daily, as I said. 58% roughly are born overseas. We have over 80 different cultures speaking 55 different languages. We have 2% of the cohort identify with a disability. We have maybe 1% of the students identify as being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. That changes, surprisingly, as the year goes on and people feel it's safe to actually declare who they are and where they come from and who their people are. And that's an interesting thing that happens for us. I'll come back to that. Okay. So in a site like ours, where we have students from refugee backgrounds, local young people who may have faced significant disruptions in their education, kids who've come out of the youth justice system. Our new arrival students are not only learning English as an additional language, they're navigating a new country, a new culture, and an education system simultaneously. The presenting issues are not unlike yours and your students, trauma, self-harm, grief, poverty, disrupted education, mental health issues, undiagnosed learning issues, low levels of literacy and numeracy, really big self-regulation issues, really big problems with overcrowded houses and the impact that that has on young people. In any given classroom, I might have 20 different students from 20 different countries, or they've come from 20 different schools, with 20 different opinions of how the teacher should be delivering to them. So you can imagine what might happen when an English-speaking background kid goes like this in a class, and the non-English speaking background students see that as the height of disrespect. We've literally had students leap across tables to bash that kid who clicked. Okay, so one of the first things that happens in a classroom at Thebarton Senior College is we make some solid agreements about respect. What does respect look like? What does it sound like? And what does it feel like? We can't have too many rules or have too many words, because I've got people operating with either zero language or really just very low level tier 1 language. And so we just really start with setting some very solid group norms that are fairly consistent across the college. With learners from so many social, cultural, community and family backgrounds accessing and participating learning experience, I want to say that we actually see the diversity and disadvantage as our superpower. When you've got a cohort who's already seen the very worst that humanity has had to offer, you can actually help them see everything that they bring to the table that actually will help them in the future survive anything that's coming next. So, once you've been through what our kids have been through, I'm talking about all of our young people, not just our refugees, SASE actually is a very low level thing that they have to get through. What we find is that all of our students benefit from the environment that we create. So we spend time recognising the unique circumstances and barriers that each of our students may face, and try to think about what the resources and support are that students are going to need. We need to understand the starting points for all of our students. They're not the same, they're never the same, and that interventions for every classroom actually then have to reflect the diversity of the group, and that actually underpins all of the work we do. And we do that on the background that the entire cohort can change in the course of 2 years. So we're in a constant state of agility and changing. We keep our Moodles out. We've got a historical backlog of Moodles that go 10 years because someone will say, do you remember 10 years ago when we did blah? Well, this is kind of the same, and we can reconnect some of that learning. So like your students, many of our students face challenges outside of the classroom that hinder their learning, and it might be their trauma from past experience or ongoing financial hardship. It could be because they've been excluded from the system. We've got a lot of forced marriage going on that we work through, mental health struggles. And so we have to think about equity is not just about what we're going to do to support students academically. It's about the curriculum supports and adjustments we make, and about the specific teaching we're going to do about capabilities and the capabilities that are going to help our young people be successful. We have a huge wellbeing team, and that may be a little bit different to your sites. We have 3 wellbeing leaders, 2 wellbeing teacher counsellors, a youth worker, an SSO3 who's specifically a counsellor, and also a visiting mental health care nurse. It needs to be that size because our students see counsellors on enrolment. They have a follow-up appointment in second semester, so 2 points of contact with that one. We've got a counsellor on duty every lesson for walk-ups. We also have a lot of students who suffer, they're dysregulated, and so that's what our SSO3 does, a lot of, soothing and calming and bringing people from the top of the ladder back to the bottom so they can, be able to manage their learning. Students can also make appointments. We've also got a career counsellor in place, and all of our students have a mentor teacher. We have a really flexible approach to the course structures. Students can be part-time. Half of our students would do vocational education, not because we're an RTO, but because we send a lot of them out to go to other places, but because they're really anxious to get into the workforce and to be contributing financially. We have developed a lot of bespoke subjects that are just, oh my God, I've only got 1 minute left. Okay, wait.
Just keep going, you're good.
All right, hang on. All right. We have a lot of bespoke subjects. Happy to talk about that later if anyone wants to come up at lunch. One of our really big strengths is that we're a United Nations Global Peace School, and we have a really strong focus on teaching students about human rights. And we think that that's really important, not just because we've got kids who face significant human rights abuses, but we find that our English-speaking background students also don't know much about their rights. And so how can they become really good global citizens if they don't know what basic and fundamental democracy is? And we use the Sustainable Development Goals. We have them embedded in our subject assessments. It's really, really important to use those because the Sustainable Development Goals emphasise that nobody gets left behind. And what an important message for students to have that regardless of your background, the United Nations has these goals that nobody gets left behind, and here's what you can do about it at a local level, in your city that you live in, and here's what we need to think about internationally. And so this really reinforces for our students how important inclusive practices are in education, and that equity and excellence go hand in hand, and that they're participating in that. So we use that as a framework so students then develop a deeper understanding of how they might contribute to a just and excellent society. We have a safe and inclusive environment. I know everybody says that, but we spend the first 100 days just about, all right, it's the first 100 days, it's really of the first 6 weeks. It's just Eva can't do the maths, where we explicitly have the students connecting with their teacher and to each other in every lesson in the context of the subject. Because in a site where everyone has come from somewhere else, if they don't, and you're unzoned, if they don't connect, they walk. And so this has been one of the single most important things that we've done to help the students learn about each other, to really take a deeper dive into what the cultural experience, the religions that make up our school, and to help everybody feel respected and celebrated. By connecting to each other and their teachers, we've got somewhere to repair back to when inevitably something will go wrong. They're teenagers, okay? So if we didn't have the relationship, we've got nowhere to go. So we do trauma-informed practice, and I know a lot of you do, but we've actually been working with the Life Buoyancy Institute on their impact program. And the reason we went with that, again, it was a linguistic choice because of the simplicity of their intervention, which is 3 words: what, and how. What's really important right now, and what do you need to do? What support do you need? How can we help you? It was so simple and so elegant as a solution that every teacher could be trained in it. Everyone could be using the same language, even the SSOs. It's very solution focused. I really have gone over. I'd like to talk to you about our timetable. We don't have time. But I think that's contributed enormously to how our students are able to succeed. I'm going to stop now because other people have things that they have to say too, and I'm going to just show you, I just want to go back, I won't show that, I want to go back to Mohammed, Christelle, Devon, Darius and Yasemin. Mohammed finished year 12 last year and is doing an apprenticeship in plastering. This was a really good outcome for him. He wanted to work, he wanted to use his hands. He's incredibly bright. He'll be running the show one day. Christelle next to him, who was new arrivals last year, is now in stage 1, and she's just got a position in a pre-employment program for aged care, and next year she'll be a school-based trainee, and we're really proud of her. Devon, who's at the front there, is currently in stage 2. She was in a fringe show, a student-driven fringe show earlier this year, and she'll be doing drama at one of the university. Darius at the back, I think, yep, he's the boy who moved from Queensland. He's at TAFE studying graphic design, and we're so proud of him. He started his own business. He's been invited to a meeting with the Festival Centre because they're really interested in his work, and we think he's going to do amazing things. And Yasemin to the right there, our textiles expert, she did get her SACE, but she understood that she needed to consolidate her language skills a bit further. So after a lot of counselling and support, she's moved into a foundation studies program at university where she can just develop her language a little bit further before she moves into nursing. I'm actually happy to talk some more at some point later, or if you want to come and ask questions. If you'd like to come and visit Theberton, we do a lot of things quite differently, but with the type of students we've got, it needs to be that way, and the flexibility needs to be there so that everyone can get where they need to be. Sorry, that was really over time.
I assume when we get to questions, someone will ask you about the timetabling. Thank you, Eva. I think you beautifully highlighted that there is so many ways to break the nexus between background and outcome. And that there's just no way to algorithm equity, because what one background and what family and what one student needs is not what another student needs. And I also have had stuck with me for a long time since knowing more about your work, how important work is, and that there we can run the risk sometimes of devaluing having a job, and assume that success is completely around a form of skills-based training or further education, or even its own secondary education. And for some people, having a job that you understand, you like, and you go to and provides you with support is an excellent, excellent outcome that we don't give enough credit for. So thank you for that, Eva. Our next speaker is Pat Thomson. So Dr. Pat Thomson is a part-time professor of education at the University of Nottingham, where her work focuses on reimagining schools to be more engaging and meaningful for children and young people. She also works part-time at the University of South Australia. Before becoming an academic, Pat was a school principal in South Australia and founded the Bowden Brompton School. Her last principalship was at Paralowie, and she was the president of SASPA and represented school principals on state, national and international policy-making bodies. Pat's current research projects investigate the sustainability of school leadership across 4 UK nations and also arts-rich primary schools. Pat, you spent your career researching how schools can be more engaging and meaningful, and I'm sure you will be able to build on Eva's context. Welcome, Dr. Pat Thomson.
Thank you. I want to talk, building on what Eva said about the school, I want to talk about the profession, and I think that's going to go somewhere else. But first of all, I want to speak as a kind of professional, really, in thinking about what equity means to me. And what that means for work as a professional, both in the schooling sector and in higher education. And I think the first thing I want to say is that, you know, with due respect to my colleague Scott, I actually see it as a very complex thing, and I think it is always about who the kids are that you've got, or the young people that you've got, where you're located, the kind of history and the expectations around all of that, your location. It's very much as well about money. No one's ever going to tell me it's not about money. And it's also clearly as well about the staff that you've got. And if you haven't got, you know, good staff in your school, then it's really hard. And I remember as a president of SASPA saying over and over again, one of the biggest equity arguments we could make is to say that we wanted a well-qualified teacher for every child in the state who was going to stay there for a reasonable amount of time. And I fear that's actually still the case in some schools. And that's criminal as far as I'm concerned, that we can't actually resolve that. It's a just absolute base level kind of thing that we need is stability in staffing. The kids need stability in staffing. It's also obviously about curriculum and pedagogy. You know, we can, for example, reduce class size. We could argue to get, you know, reductions in class size to 20, but we know that that actually by itself isn't going to make a difference. If you teach a class of 20 as if they're actually a class of 50 and use crowd control kind of techniques, it's not going to make much of a difference. You obviously have to do stuff with curriculum and pedagogy as well, and, you know, assessment practice is important. So it's kind of all the way that all those things fit together, and then how it is that these actually fit within the system, that's important. So for me, you know, the concept of a system that's going to be just and where all kids are going to have actually be able to have an opportunity to get the kind of full 12 years of education to which they're entitled. You know, we've got a very long way still to go towards that. But, you know, for me, that's not simply about a kind of narrow set of outcomes. It's very much tied to the question of that everybody's talked about, I think, what we see the purposes are for education. And I think as a profession, we've got a kind of obligation to think about the purposes, but also how it is that we as professionals work ethically together for a just system. And I want to be provocative and say that this is not just about how we manage our schools. It's actually how, as a body of professionals, we work in a public school system, which is itself inequitable. I mean, you know, we've got schools that are really doing it tough and schools that are actually doing pretty well. And we've got to manage that. We've got to manage within a policy context in which there is competition, not only with the non-government sector, but also amongst ourselves. And we've got to manage in a system where there's still kind of unfair selection practices. We've got to manage in a system where, you know, some schools, mainly I'd suggest from the non-government sector, send kids they don't want to deal with to us, you know, and these kind of competitive situations that we're in, and the inequity which is based, you know, which is based around distribution of population, on housing, on transport, on you know, work. We have to work within that as a profession, and, you know, it's not for me as part of a profession. If somebody else is struggling, that's in their school, then that's my problem too. That's not just their problem. That's a professional problem that we face as being part of a public system, and a public system is not just about getting public money and you know, being in competition with the non-publics. It's also about making publics, and it's about making societies at the same time. And I do just want to say, I think that part of this kind of ethical behaviour. You know, a lot of professions actually have codes of ethical conduct, and I'm not kind of sure that that's something that we talk about in Australia very much. Having been in England for the last 21 years, you know, one of the things that has been interesting in recent times in England has been that the Association of School and College Leaders, which is the equivalent of SASPA in England, have worked on developing a code of ethics because partly as a way to develop some principles in which can be used to underpin the way that they work together in a highly inequitable system. I mean, it's an awful system, you know, league tabled, and, you know, competition is just enormous, and in which some people have actually kind of gamed the system in order to get kind of personal advantage. You can kind of understand why, because their heads get chopped off, they lose their schools, you know, in minutes if their results aren't fair. But in order to manage themselves as a profession, ASCL developed a code of ethics, and it's kind of really very strongly tied into questions of equity and justice across a kind of government system. And they talked about, I just want to quickly kind of read some of them out. They talk about selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability to the public, openness, honesty, and then they talk about leaders demonstrating the kind of behaviours that they expect of students, and they talk about trust, wisdom, kindness, justice, service, courage, optimism. And it does seem to me that these are also strongly tied to the ways in which we might think about leading for equity, leading a kind of a system which might work together more for fairer outcomes that might make a difference for more kids. And thinking about the profession, I want to say that professions have kind of long-term views. You know, we live in a system governed by 3-year political cycles, and as a profession we've got to have a longer view than that. And I think we could learn a lot from kind of First Nations peoples actually about the long-term view. 2 examples, the Haudenosaunee, who used to be known, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who used to be known as the Iroquois Nations or the Six Nations Confederacy, whose land was kind of divided by America, the US and Canada. They had a parliament, they had a constitution, a documented constitution, which they claim is the basis for the US Constitution. A lot of it's modelled on their kind of rules and procedures. But they had a person in the parliament who was responsible for thinking about 7 generations hence. That was their job. They didn't make a decision unless they thought about what the long-term generational consequence was. Amazing, eh? Not suggesting we can do that, but think about that foresight. The Kaurna were known to have, you know, our First Nations had a wonderful education system, lifelong, life-wide, pedagogically flexible to what was going on in the environment, you know, managed to survive well and live well here for, you know, 60,000 years. The Kaurna are known for having had a 2-month conference fairly regularly, not every year, but, you know, kind of like fairly regularly, where they'd come together to renew their curriculum, to adjust to what was happening, to get people from the various parts of the Kaurna Nation together and say, what's been going on? What have you had to change? We know that the Nurrungeri, you know, these are not static education systems is what I'm saying. You know, the Nurrungeri stories talk about the land bridge to Kangaroo Island. They talk about the Ice Age and what they had to do in order to adjust their education system to continue living. And we could learn a lot from that kind of foresight. And a lot of people have talked about, I think, the kind of challenges that our young people are going to face, you know, the kind of terrible sort of violence that's going on in the world and the casualties of the violence in the world that a lot of Eva's students have experienced firsthand, the kind of planetary crisis that we're facing. It's scary being a young person today and thinking about what's going on in the future. And I think even as much as we might like the national curriculum at the moment, we have to maintain a kind of sight on what is it that young people are going to need to know and know how to do. What foundations do we have to build in the school to actually equip them for the kind of world that they're going into? We've got a duty as a profession, I think. We're custodians, we're servants of the future. We make the future. We have, as a social institution and as a profession, we have an intergenerational responsibility. And I think that's really important that we talk about that. And for me, that's what, this word equity is about. It's about thinking about, do we want to continue to reproduce the kind of inequitable society that we've got at present, or do we really want to try and create something different? It's not simply about distribution of results. It's really about the kind of world that we want. And I want to conclude by saying, and I'm slightly over, that, profession and professor contain a common word in there, which is to profess. And profess really means that we advocate for something, that we have a set of values and beliefs that are common to us as a profession, that are about kind of caring and nurturing the future, and the young people who are going to live in the future, and we hope live well. And we have got a kind of duty, I think, as well, to be their voice and to speak on their behalf, to allow them to speak as much as they can, but also to advocate on their behalf. And I think that possibly segues into Peter.
Oh, I've got about 40 questions now, Pat. I think one of the things I heard early on there was also about the need to be brave and to find courage in naming what's wrong in the system that you work in now. It's not disloyal to your profession. It's not disloyal to your department. It's not disloyal to your government to say, I know what's not working here. I know what's not fair, and that's going to require individual and collective courage. And so I think there's something in that part of it to think about. Peter is going to talk about that collective idea of what response is possible if we work collectively as an association to drive the outcomes that you are the expert in knowing that you need. So Peter Mader is currently a PhD candidate at Flinders University, with his thesis focusing on principal associations and political agency within neoliberal policy regimes. As the inaugural Chief Executive of the South Australian Secondary Principals Association, I'd like that test. Can I take that test? Peter also served as its full-time president from 2015 to 2020. In addition to his state-based leadership, Peter has held national roles including board director and vice president of the Australian Secondary Principals Association. His contributions to education have earned him several awards, including the John Lang Professional Development Award and the Leadership Award of ACEL. Welcome, Peter Mader.
Excellent, thank you. As a segue from Pat to my presentation, I'd just like to hold up a book. Its short title is Resistance in Educational Leadership, and much of what I'm going to say is taken from chapter 13 of this book, which was co-authored by Chris Dolan and myself. Pat's the editor, one of the editors of this book, and if you're interested in the profession, if you're interested in the work of principal associations and the idea of resisting in the context that Pat's shared with us, you may be interested in having a look at that. So I'm going to talk about the context of principal associations. So we're all here as members of principal associations, and what I want you to think about in the context today is we often see that association as networking and building professional capacity to support the work that we do in schools, and that is hugely important work. I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'm going to talk about the other part of our work as an association, which is the political work, that advocacy that was referenced by Pat. So I'm not going to read the slide to you, but I would point out that one of the things about critiquing aspects of policy that government and bureaucracies form that doesn't align well with our profession, we can do that as an association because there's safety in numbers, that we're not truth-telling from a principal perspective at Mount Barker High School. G'day, Dave, how are you? We're actually doing some truth-telling from the perspective of a principal association. So your voice is in there, but it's coming from the board and the Chief Executive and its President. What I did want to spend a little bit of time on with this side is the notion of insiders and outsiders. So we work proudly for the public education system, and within that we are insiders. We're part of the team that's trying to do the best we possibly can for every young person in South Australia in that system. But when we need to critique it, we become outsiders. And so I'm underlining that point again, that there is safety in doing so as the voice of the profession, pushing back to the government or to the system around aspects of our policy that are working against, in this context, the issue of equity. And lastly, the whole idea of political agency, which is the subject of my thesis, is that principal associations are actually a product of that. Why do professions actually come together in a constituted form and form a collective identity if it's not to do things like critique policy, push back, find new ways, better ways of doing things on behalf of, in our context, the students in public education. Gosh, that time is going fast. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about working on equity. It says working towards equity, but I think I meant it the other way. Can you actually read that? Yeah? So whenever I think of this problem, I think of what Richard Teese wrote about, and the idea of social inequalities arise in education because the demands made by the curriculum outstrip the cultural resources of the schools their children attend. So when you think back to Danielle's story about her family's issues, that's exactly what Teese is tapping into there. That at some point, our students have, or some of our students have so many needs that as a system and as a school, we don't have the cultural resources to address them. And think about Eva's story from a Theberton perspective. So just a very quick personal story for me. The last time that I was a principal of a school, Category 3 school, a bit like Eva's in that we had a very strong vet program that we were running. And we took a number of students from other schools in that vet program. So Certificate 3, Information and Communication Technology. One of the students in that group was from that Equitable Terrace school that your father... No, that I won't either. PAC. You know, that image of the boy being suspended over the fence may have actually been the student that college and my school had in common. Because I've got a phone call that said, you know, Jared's at the risk of not completing his schooling. He's one of our boarders. And the only thing that he's not over the line in is your Certificate 3 program. So can we have a meeting to make sure that Jared gets through? So fair enough, you know, it's at 6 p.m. at night. I get a phone call en route from the PAC people. And, you know, we're just coming into your car park now. So I thought, I'll do the right thing. I'll go out and meet them a bit late at night. And a minibus showed up. And 5 educators stepped out of the minibus So this is a border. Parents are paying $30,000 a year for an education. The deputy principal, the head of Year 12, the head of the boarding program, the research project mentor and so on, all step out and we have a conversation about how we're going to get Jared over the line. And the issue is those who've worked in vet programs, you know that it's competency-based. You've actually got to do the work. So that's just a quick example of how there's disparity. I mean, that's a system versus system thing, but disparity in cultural resources that prevents some young people from achieving, whereas those who are more privileged are able to achieve because of what's wrapped around them. So what I wanted to do just with this slide, and very quickly, I've got 3 minutes left, is I think what we've been doing for a long time now is we've been working on the components of the issues in policy around equity. So at the moment, you know, there's a big thing with sector funding, you know, and we need our fair share of that. Of course we do. But once we get that sector funding, there are issues that we try and address using principal associations and other advocacy collectives to make sure that those funds go to the right parts of the sector. But we're working in a system where governments have made schools a marketplace. And, you know, there's clearly a policy effect where parents are encouraged to access the school of their choice. And what that actually does is it creates, you know, archipelagos within systems where, you know, some people are getting on a bus outside of your school and going to one quite a distance away. And, you know, on one hand, we'd say, well, that's great if they're sticking with public education. But what happens is some of the very cultural resources that you need within your school are going down to another school. So the less students in your school who have that capacity to leverage in your classrooms, you know, higher education standards, the more difficult and complex it is for your teachers in your classrooms and in your schools. Now that's a product of nothing that we created. That's a product of what's happened with policy. And we would be, if we thought that was great, we'd just say status quo, let it roll. But if we thought that it was wrong, then that would justifiably be something that we would pick off and try and tackle as a profession, as an association. And acknowledging that, you know, we've talked about the importance of school funding or resources that have a fiscal component to them. It's what you do with the money that's really important. And I was talking to Chris Roberts, I'm not sure if Chris is here today. I was talking to him yesterday that East Murray Area School once had $23,000 per student sitting in its SASPA account and was getting annually its res on top of that. And every student at that school, which is now closed, you know, should have received the value of that dollar in their learning. Why was it sitting there? Well, because we didn't have a system that enabled that money to be used with the people that could use it, because you couldn't get people there. And if you could get them there, you couldn't get them to stay. So money's one thing, but if you don't work on the other bits of policy that interface with that money and what it's intended to be used for, then that's a problem as well. I've gone well and truly over time. So what I really wanted to say with this slide is you can keep working on the componentry and see how far we get. But you have to also work on the ideology. What's been working against us in the equity field has got policy arms to it, but it's also got an ideology behind it. And that's something that we can do as a profession, as principal associations, to push back on and to work on. Very quickly, whoops, I knew there was, okay, I'm not going to go through that slide piecemeal, but what I'm trying to do here and what Chris and I were trying to do with our chapter is say, look, there's some tactics that we should be trying. And some of these tactics we've used, but they haven't necessarily moved the dial in terms of what it is that we've been going after. So we use the word advocacy a lot in our work in this association. And advocacy, I think, is really good for those little separate parts of policy. You know, we need the funding to go to the right spots in our system. And when we get it there, it would be good if we had a system that enabled the HR to follow it. I think you advocate for those sorts of things. But if you actually want to tackle the ideology, if you actually want to go after the macro piece and make sure that the government and the system are behind where the profession wants to go with equity, then I think you have to start looking at being an activist. And when I say you, I mean the collective we, because there's risks associated with activism. And I just wanted to quickly finish with this. Hopefully you'll recognise some of those activists on the screen. Now, those of you who know me well know that I'm fanatical about NFL and the San Francisco 49ers. Go Niners! Okay, settle down. And so in the centre of that screen, you can see some 49ers players who, during the national anthem, are taking a knee. Now, when you take a knee in the game, that's when you basically are stopping play. So as a symbol of resistance, of activism, some of that team were taking a knee while the national anthem was being played, because why would you put hand over heart to a national anthem that basically was enabling racism to be running riot in their streets? So this was not long after the George Floyd incident, which I think we were well across in Australia. The gentleman above that team taking a knee is the one who started it all. He was the highest paid player. He was the quarterback. Even if you don't know NFL, you've probably heard the term quarterback. The quarterback runs the game, basically. After he took the knee and joined the Black Lives Matter movement, he lost his contract with the 49ers. The head of the NFL Commission came out strongly and made sure that no other owner in the 31 other teams picked him up. So all of the people in that picture are people who had courage of conviction. And so if you're going to advocate and chip away at the equity issue, that's a great thing. You'll need a little bit of courage for that. If you're going to go the next step and work on the ideology piece and try and shift the dial on that, you're going to need courage of conviction. And that's where the unity of the profession through principal associations can be so strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. My first and quick observation on that is how the more we think we're special and different, the more we are the same. I had a similar conversation to that in the health sector around how do you, if you are a doctor or a nurse in public health, abide by your code of conduct, operate in the system that you have to operate in, and still make what they feel to be a set of urgent changes that are urgent. I think there is so much more that we can use our institutions for, including SASPA, to provide us that cover to be the activist that we want to be while still maintaining all of the, I suppose, professional responsibilities you might have as a public servant and as a public education teacher. We have run wildly over time. Is everybody up for a couple of questions before lunch?
Early lunch? Sorry.
Has anyone got a question?
I'd love to hear about Eva's timetable.
thank you. I'd love to talk about the timetable just briefly. Our school is structured very differently to other sites, but the single biggest advantage our school has is that our students have 100 minutes times 3 lessons a week, which over the course of a semester gives them, so I'm going to look at 30 more hours than you would normally get in SACE. And so that extra time then allows for building of foundational skills in literacy, numeracy. We can work really hard on the capabilities. There's a whole lot of work that can happen because of those extra hours. And I know that when we brought that timetable in some 12 years ago, that was when our SACE improvement journey, the trajectory really started to go up because we had extra time. And that was what was just and fair, because you think about our students as being the ones who haven't had the same education as everyone else. They've either been excluded from a system or absent from a system, or because of human rights didn't have a system to access. So the extra time was what helped for them. So that the whole seniors, secondary, generally speaking, 100 minutes times 3 per subject per week, giving us, over the course of a year, 60 extra hours in year 12. Makes a difference. Makes a difference to the relationships too, because the relationships-based approach is key. If the students don't feel that there's a relationship there, they're not going to come to your class.
I have a question, which is, it's my observation that parents are more individual and are culturally trained when they have small babies to find the best choice of baby carrier, the best type of childcare. They go and visit 12 childcare centres. They then pay an extraordinary amount of money to send them there. And we then ask them after 5 years of that to take a collective approach. We say, please take a collective approach to equity and be concerned for all the children in your children's lives, not just your own child. How can we get around a culture that says, my child is so important and special and precious, and my lack of interest in everybody else's children continues to grow?
Yes. Okay, Pat's going to do that one.
Well, the hardest thing I ever have had to do over and over again as a school leader was to tell parents living in poverty that the odds of their kids doing brilliantly at school were stacked against them, but we would do our best. So I just want to spin that around and say, you know, they're actually the parents we want to be most concerned about, not the parents that have got X number of choices and you know, dollars behind them and can give donations to their school and spend time on committees because they're not working 3 jobs and casually and all of that stuff. It's the parents, you know, of the kid. They desperately want their kids to do well, but we just know the system isn't going to work in their favour. And to try and talk about how it is we're actually going to do that and what we're going to do is a really hard job. And I think that's the key thing. And I always remember kind of Raewyn Connell's kind of statement around schooling. If you can get schooling right for the most disadvantaged kids, it's going to be good for everybody.
I'm still interested in how we convince everybody of that. And I think part of that answer has to be telling the story over and over and over again. Yeah.
Is this working? Yeah, this is working. What I'd add to Pat's piece is the notion of, you know, if we're arguing within the profession and our ranks that we want a fairer and more just system, then I think there's other people outside of our system who are arguing for a fairer and more just society. So, I mean, one of the theories that I've looked at in my thesis is the notion of chains of equivalence, where organisations join with other organisations who have a similar interest in changing something. And that's why they're together. They're not together for any other reason. They might, you know, disagree violently on lots of other things, but there would be people out there or organisations out there who do want to work with others on a fairer and more just society, which then puts our narrative into the bigger narrative, and the bigger narrative helps our narrative.
My very last question will be, is there a role for you as educators in looking at the other drivers more and partnering with the other drivers more? So the drivers of disability funding, the drivers of income support, the drivers of housing, and taking policy views on the drivers of inequity of the kids in your schools. So it is not because of their access to you and education, it is usually whole other tranches of public policy that that leaves them in that statistical situation that you are then unravelling. Is there a role for you to take more views on that broader sense of policy drivers?
There does seem to be a gap, Danielle, between all of the agencies that work with students, and all of our students sit on, our schools all have fault lines on which, you know, Centrelink, housing, the NDIS, and you see the cracks between all of that. I just have to give this example from Theberton. Just when you've got a person who really understands all of the government systems really, really well, you're so advantaged in your school. So I've got a youth worker who just understands the systemic, how the system works really, really well, and he knows how to get in there and agitate for change. And so he's supported our students who weren't being paid the appropriate amounts of Centrelink benefit. And over the past, I don't know, how many years was it? Over the past maybe 5 or 6 years, he's clawed back $500,000 of owed money to them. So we call him the $500,000 man now. But I just think about, all right, systemically, this is not just happening in my school, this is happening in everyone's schools where their kids are not getting the right Centrelink benefit, they're not getting paid the appropriate amount, their NDIS isn't being delivered properly. How many millions of dollars are not being delivered to the people who need the money?
Yep.
And I just feel so fortunate that I've got Evan Babbister. But you know, every school needs an Evan Babbister, and that doesn't answer your question. No. But it is the level of support. But what we need is a systemic approach where someone actually has a bird's eye view on all of the policies that impact on us in schools and how it affects kids. I'd start with immigration, but you know, that's just me.
Pat or Peter?
Well, yeah, absolutely, I agree. I mean, I think we do need to be able to understand public policy as a kind of a coherent agenda, and that people's lives are not divided into education and health and welfare. It's the government that divides them that way. And so I think we really have to start from what do everyday lives actually look like. And I think people in schools actually have got a kind of good view of that on the ground, what they look like, but it's actually working up then to understand how it is we can present that in terms of the overall public policy agenda. We know about things like transport and kids getting to and from school. I think we know about the way that housing policies or lack of policies and the actions of developers and real estate agents can kind of affect the mix of kids that actually end up in your school. That when, you know, Holdens go bust, as they did, you know, in the northern suburbs, it profoundly affected what actually went on in the schools in the north. The same with Mitsubishi in the south. You know, that employment policy is really important, and we know that income support policy is also really important. And when the kind of ceiling levels of the welfare policy we've got kind of creates the division between the rich and the poor. And if we look at countries that sort of the Nordic kind of solution, if you go to Norway and see the way in which unemployment benefits are and parenting leave benefits are pitched much higher, you can actually kind of see how public policy creates divisions, which then actually end up in our schools. They're not left at the gates, they're in the schools. So it's the kind of overview of public policy, which I think is really important.
Yeah. Thank you. I suppose one of the things I would wrap up with is storytelling is your biggest power. It's your superpower, because you can tell those stories that others can't tell, whether that's in your site, whether that's across the profession, or whether that's collectively to build a story of the gaping, cavernous holes that South Australian young people fall through between the different systems. Keep telling your story. It is not a data-driven world. That does not actually influence and make public policy change in the way that I think we've been trained to believe in the last 10 years. Tell your story of your children who miss out and your students who miss out, because we do not talk about those missing out students in a broad political, public community sense anymore. We use vulnerable, we use SES, we don't say poor, we don't say people are missing out. And so I'd encourage you to, whether you are more site specific or looking for a broader political action, to just keep telling your stories. And not to add to the national teacher workforce crisis, but I would point out that the Democratic Vice President candidate is in fact one of your own. And so if being a school leader and an educator doesn't work out for you, you could always take to politics yourselves and tell the story about hungry kids without lunch in your own school sites. There are lots and lots and lots of ways with which you can influence change, and there are people who want to hear what you've got to say and your stories, so keep telling your stories that lead to that change.